you so much. Thank you, Shiva. I have to thank you for inviting me, but everybody give her a hand because, it happened. I was here last year, too. Last year, by the way, everybody came wearing a face mask because the air was so bad. But last year, as well as this year, the person who preceded me was just like the perfect lead-in to what I want to be talking about. So I'm delighted. Let me get organized here. Everybody dies in the middle of a conversation, and you've just been hearing about that. And unless we find a way to continue that conversation, the part of us that lives in that conversation dies too. So we have to find where we were in the conversation and continue it and do what is the hardest task for human beings to do, which is to turn the physical relationship into a spiritual relationship. Before we can continue the conversation, however, we have to find our own voices. So does anybody here, is there a way of, does anybody here know why Jews serve round things like lentils and eggs or bagels in a house of mourning? Circle of life, that's what everyone says, and it's not wrong. However, according to the holy texts, it is because, like the lentil, the mourner has no mouth. And the Jewish rituals of early mourning, such as the practices that take place in the house of Shiva, the house of mourning, are designed to help mourners to find their mouth, to help mourners to find their voice. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel famously said there are 3 ascending levels of expressing mourning. Tears, the first, is the lowest. Silence comes next, and that is higher. And then a song, and that is the highest. What Heschel didn't say is that the sound that comes from that sound also has ascending levels. It certainly does not begin as a song of celebration. It begins wordlessly, and in Judaism we have something called a nigun, which is a wordless song. And then the nigun harnesses the emotions that lie below the words, and they can be emotions that have been held inside for God knows how long, and many of them were discussed just before I spoke. And the song is to help the mourner find his or her mouth, to give those feelings an outlet and a path as the mourner quite literally comes to terms with, finds the words for the grief's hard to express feelings that have been trapped in silence inside until the mourner can begin to talk about it. I grew up in New Orleans, and like the music at the jazz funerals that I remember from growing up there, the song begins with a wordless dirge. In New Orleans, the first thing you would hear is ya da 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 da, really a slow dirge. And then it yokes the unbearable pain and then slowly channels its song through the levels of grief. And as it does, the song's cadence slowly changes. And by the time that the people leave the cemetery, it's die, da, 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 da. So it starts off so slowly, so slowly, and then it begins to turn into an affirmation of life, a celebration of life, just like the words of the Kaddish, which is about making life meaningful in the world. So the music is what carries. The song may go from a dirge to a rant to a cry. It could be the blues. a chant, a ballad, and this happens in no particular order, and it doubles back because we have to revisit feelings again and again. So it doubles back on all the musical genres until finally, ultimately, the mourning is fully honored, and that song becomes a hymn that is an affirmation of life in the face of human finitude in terms of our own mortality. There's a phrase in Psalm 30 that says that you have turned my mourning into dancing. It's a phrase that's attributed to King David, but David's word for dance is as nuanced as Heschel's songs. And to translate that word for dance, David wrote in the line, "You have turned my mourning into dancing." You have to first know that in Hebrew, there are 11 words for dancing, and they all have different nuances. So there are, happy dances, and there are difficult dances, there are leaping dances, there are fun dancing, and they're really difficult dancing. So the word that David used is not rikud, which means a fun and recreational dance, but a mahal. A mahal is a ritual dance, often it performed in a circle, and it is often compared to the motions that women make when they are giving birth. And when we mourn, we do give birth. We give birth to a new self, to a new way of being in a greatly altered world, and a new conversation with a person or situation which is lost. It was a circle dance that gave birth to my own healing. In 1971, I was 24, and my life was suddenly and unexpectedly uprooted by two events. First, my mother committed suicide, and then 3 months later, my sister died in a car accident. She was not driving. So instinctively, I ran from New Orleans to my safe place, which was Berkeley in 1971. And I read the same book that many of you may have been reading in 1971, and it was Be Here Now by Ram Dass, you know the book? And from Rabbi Ram Dass, I learned the phrase unbearable compassion. Unbearable compassion. I wrote it on a little piece of paper, and I drew an infinity sign over it, and I placed it on the wall so that it was at eyesight when I meditated or did yoga. Inhale, unbearable. Exhale, compassion. Unbearable compassion. Unbearable compassion. After a while, I stood and I danced it. They balanced each other out. Unbearable compassion. Unbearable compassion. And I would go as far as I could into the unbearable, and then I would balance it with compassion. Unbearable. My mother was dead. Unbearable. My sister was dead. Unbearable. My world was shattered. Compassion for myself. It's the forgiveness that was just talked about. Compassion for my mother and her struggles. Compassion for my sister who led such a short life. And compassion for God. At first, my movements were quite shallow. I could only dip so far into the unbearable because the pain was too great. Others, the compassion was limited. I was angry at my mother and even at my sister for leaving me. And God, don't get me started. That's a conversation for another time. As time goes on, I discovered that there's always more to explore. In the conversation with my grief and with the persons I mourn, there's always more to learn. But as I began to know the size and the shape of my pain, I found that I could go deeper into the side of the unbearable, and I wouldn't get lost in the compassion, so lost that I denied my pain and the place I needed to make for my own suffering. So unbearable allowed me to face all the pain. Compassion helped me to balance it without getting lost in the compassion I might have had for my mother. It was hard, and I felt sorry for her. She hurt me, and I could understand. It took a long time. One of my favorite stories, my ex-husband, who was very funny, said something once, and I was talking about my mother. This is maybe 25 years after she died, and he said, you know, she hasn't been so bad lately. And it wasn't because she had died. It wasn't because she was gone. It was because I had continued to work on the relationship and myself and my relationship with her. And at some point, the things that had been good about her, her wonderful qualities, became salient. And that was the person with whom I was having a relationship. So I just thought that was an incredible statement of the possibility that relationships can change. But I started telling that story shortly after it happened. And after a while, it was starting to sound like shtick to me, you know? So I was wondering, what's this all about? And my daughter had just become an adolescent. And I found myself processing my adolescence and and so it was like I was angry at my mother again for certain things, and I was remembering. And the truth was, it was wonderful, because it was like we were still in dynamic communication, and the relationship was still growing and changing. The mystics tell us that when we say Kaddish, or perform acts of goodness on the part of someone who has died, we are affecting their souls, and we make it possible for their souls to keep rising and to keep healing. And then not only are we healing them, but we're also healing our relationship, ourselves. And my sense is that since I had this metaphor from the Kabbalists about this dynamic connection between the worlds, it enabled me to really believe that it was possible to keep the conversation going. Anyway, I began this understanding of unbearable and compassion long before I knew much about Jewish ritual. I did not know at the time that the Hebrew word for compassion, which is rachamim, was related to the word for womb. The womb that I longed to be held in as a suddenly motherless child. I wish I had known at the time that the Jewish mourning rituals would provide me with both a womb and a circle dance. And Yizkor is one of those rituals, and I'm going to be talking about it today. And this handout, we're not going to exactly be dealing with it unless we have a ton of more time. It will be up online if you want to work with it. It's also in this new version of my book, Mourning and Mitzvah. But you can get it online. So Yizkor is a memorial service. It takes place 4 times a year, and you can. Ooh, sorry. Whoops! I've lost everything. Sorry, I've lost my thing here. Oh. All right, so I don't need it, but it'd be better if I had it. Thank you. Well, I thought it was a good idea. I thought, it saves paper, and the fact is that it's it allows me to change what I'm going to say up until the last minute, but it has just, I'm going to try this. Yizkor is recited 4 times a year. It is a prayer in which we ask God to remember the soul of the person who's died. And here it is. And it's a memorial service, and it's connected, as I think I said before I was so rudely interrupted, it is said 4 times, it's connected with days of observance on which the Yizkor prayer is recited. So liturgically, as I said, the Yizkor prayer asks God to remember the souls of the ones we've lost. It also gives us an opportunity to focus our grief in the company of others who have also been touched by loss, as together we remember those whom we have held close and then surrendered to the inscrutable mystery that determines life and death, the great mystery which I like to call the artist formerly known as God. After the Yizkor prayer, we recite the El Maleh Rachamim prayer, and the El Rachamim prayer means God filled with compassion, and it asks for compassion for the continuing journey of departed souls, and that is followed, after that we recite the Kaddish, in which we express our hope for a world that will be infused with God's great name. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go through the 4 seasons. It turns out that each of the days of Yizkor, on each of the holidays or days of observance, can be connected with one of the phases of mourning, one of the essential tasks of mourning, and one of the ways that we must find to continue the conversation. The Yizkor practice, because it comes over and over again, 4 times a year, every year, it both acknowledges that grief doesn't end just because we've put in the tombstone and lifted the curtain. It gives us a place on the calendar that we can be mourners again, and that we can focus ourselves in such a way to see where we are in the conversation. It allows us to go as deep as we are able to go at any one time into the unbearable, and to ask God to provide the compassion, knowing that in a few months, the circle dance of the seasons, there will be another opportunity to test the waters, to see how much we can dose the unbearable, as we deepen ourselves as well as our wombs of compassion, wombs that hold our pain, nurture it, and bring it comfort in order to give birth to our own deeper understanding of ourselves, what it means to be human on a planet where living things die, as well as to give birth to a new relationship with the person who is gone. I'm careful when I speak of the deceased to not say loved one, although of course I suspect for many of you that would be an appropriate word to use. But the people who most often need the healing that is provided by Yizkor may have been in difficult relationships, and I want them to feel included in this process, because I think that Yizkor, as I said, by describing my relationship with my mother and the changes in it, Yizkor really does provide a relationship for healing a difficult relationship, as well as celebrating a relationship that was a good one. Yizkor gives us a place where over the years these relationships can continue to evolve. And it also acknowledges, as I said, that grief just doesn't magically end at any one date. I know that for some people, when they have this sort of magical thinking that at the end of the first year, or when the tombstone is set, suddenly everything will be back to normal or good again. And then they're terribly disappointed, because certainly in Judaism, the first year you were held under the category of mourner. The second year can be more difficult because you don't have that, although what you do have are these days of memorial, which give you that permission. So grief doesn't end the conversation. Rather, Yizkor allows us to do the hardest thing a human must do, as I mentioned earlier, to turn that relationship where we can smell them and see them and hear them into something that transcends all of the senses and is a relationship of heart to heart. And as I said, in the case of relationships that have been problematic, our ritual of remembrance allows us to do for those with whom we have struggled what we ask God to do on Yom Kippur, the first day when Yizkor of the year in which Yizkor is recited, when we ask God to remember us and turn from judgment to compassion and from anger to love. I call this process doing Kaddish. In Judaism, we say Kaddish, but the real work of grief is doing Kaddish, which is the work of healing and ultimately coming to what the words of Kaddish teach us, which is that some people say that what the Kaddish talks about is what the dead would say to us if they could come back and tell us what is really important in the world, which is making the world a place filled with holiness and with the holiness of God's name. So what I'm going to do now is to walk you through the cycle of seasons and to allow the work in the imaginal world to take over. And I have to say that the work in the imaginal world can be as profound and potent, sometimes even more so, than the work we might have been able to do when the people are that we have lost are sitting beside us. There's another gift of the Kabbalists, of the Jewish mystics, is a sense of the the afterlife journey. And one of the first things that they tell us happens is that the soul of the deceased is taken by two angels, and they put them in these big spoons. They put the soul in the spoon, and they throw it from one end of the universe to the other, like lacrosse. And as they do it, all the dust falls away. So what is the dust? It's all of the accretions that the slings and bows and woes of outrageous fortune put on our souls, defending them. So that when I look, I don't see, we're not radiant soul to radiant soul. I'm seeing you through lenses that are obscured by all of the pains that may have had an effect on me over the course of my life. So the angels get rid of that. So for people who may have had difficult relationships, when there were things that you couldn't say or couldn't talk about, or the sense that you haven't been seen, those things fall away. So in many ways, people are more accessible in the imaginal world on some level. So we're going to visit the 4 days of Yizkor, the themes of the days that they're recited, and see how the conversation has shifted and changed from previous years as relationships continue to evolve. And please be mindful. I don't know how our time will pan out. We may go through 3 years of karma. We may just make it through one. But do know that Yizkor comes year after year after year, season after season after season. There's always another opportunity. One of the things that breaks my heart the most is when people say, well, now he's gone. You know, I can never tell him. And I know, I understand it, but I also know the power of the imaginal world, and also that the power of the kaf hakela that gets the dust off so that we can really have even more meaningful conversations. So if you can only go so far into the unbearable, or into the compassion, know that the time will come again, and it may be easier to do next time. So have compassion on yourself as we do this. When we have gone through the 4 days, there'll be time for questions, and if there's time, we will go through the cycle again, and maybe even again. And see if even in this short time when we're working together, your conversation has changed. And in the end, we'll look at some of the prayers in the Yizkor service, and we'll even do a little dance. Close your eyes. Begin by closing your eyes. Get comfortable in your seat. Feel a good, strong, solid base with your feet, with your tush on the chair. And imagine someone, just one person, that you would like to remember today. So in the autumn, we have the days of awe. The first one is Yom Kippur. And as many of you know, that Yom Kippur and the 40 days that precede us are spent asking forgiveness from other people and from God and from ourselves for places that we have missed the mark. So imagine yourself sitting with the person you are remembering. Imagine that you're having a conversation, the conversation you were in the middle of when death or illness seemed to bring it to an end. So in the spirit of the days of awe, I want you to do an accounting of the soul, a cheshbon hanefesh, and see if there's something for which you might want to ask them for forgiveness. Now, while you're doing that, I want to point out that another name for Yom Kippur is Yom Hakippurim, which means day not just of atonement, but day of atonements. And the belief is that we also do atonement for the souls of the people who are gone. And so maybe there's something that they need to ask for forgiveness. Perhaps something they couldn't say when they were alive. So give them a chance to also ask you for forgiveness. Sometimes, and I have a template for it in the book, I ask people to write letters, and I have prompts for that, to the person who has died, as well as letters from them, imagining what they might say in response. But see if just in this moment, the process creates a softening or a tenderness or more compassionate gaze as you imagine yourself in dialogue with them. And if not, just take a breath and know that you'll come back to this as the seasons roll, and perhaps it will be easier next time. The second day that Yizkor is recited is everybody's favorite holiday, Shemini Atzeret. How many of you have even heard of Shemini Atzeret? Some. It is the day after Sukkot, it's the most notable thing about that day is that the liturgy changes and we begin to pray for rain. So rain is a metaphor in grief for tears, of course. Everybody has regrets. Everyone has something that they need to cry about. Some of our regrets can be worked through as we make peace with the fact that there's no way we could have been omniscient in our relationships. Sometimes there are things we could have done better, things that we have to sit and mourn, mistakes that can become our teachers if we're willing to view them with compassion, if we're willing to go into the unbearable and hold it in the womb of our heart. So in Shemini Atzeret, or through the lens of Shemini Atzeret, our tears need to fall like the rain which we begin to pray for on that holy day. It's a day that my teacher, one of my teachers, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, said God would say to those who were preparing to leave the temple after Sukkot, following that joyous holiday, and God would say, don't go, stay another day, and that's what Shemini Atzeret is. It means 8th day of assembly, an extra day tacked on. But but don't go are the same words of yearning that we might want to say to a person who is gone. So take a breath and allow yourself your regrets or your sad yearning. Go as deep into the unbearable as feels safe. And allow your tears to fall like rain, in the words of Ezekiel, to turn your hearts of stone into hearts of flesh, hearts sheathed in layers of protection into tender, vulnerable, feeling, beating hearts, what the Torah calls actually circumcised hearts, hearts that are open to feeling. So allow your heart to be broken open like a seed underground in winter, absorbing the water that breaks it open in order to bring new life. And just feel it. There are certain things we can change and certain things we can't. And they are worth our tears. To paraphrase Camus, in the midst of winter, and Shemini Atzeret ushers in the winter, in the midst of winter we begin to long for spring. And the next day we recite Yizkor is on the 8th day of our spring festival, Pesach. So Pesach gives us a lens in our grief to examine, how am I still living in someone else's land? How am I still doing the bidding of one who no longer walks in this world? How am I still enslaved by grief or by obligations? Camus also said that no matter how great a relationship, it eclipses a piece of the sky. And when that relationship is no longer present, you once more have access to that piece of the sky. I should be. So questions to ask yourself in the key of Pesach are, how ready am I for my own unique piece of the sky? How willing am I to live my own life? How am I still in bondage and choosing to be in bondage to the past? There's no right or wrong answer. It's just something to explore. And you can explore it now. You can get deeper into it next year. The 4th day that Yizkor is recited is Shavuot. It is a harvest festival during which we commemorate receiving the gift of Torah and dance with it in gratitude. So, through the lens of Shavuot, we ask, what was the Torah of the relationship with the person who is gone? What were their teachings? What did I learn from them? What was their gift to me? And this is important, am I ready to express my gratitude? And if so, how might I commemorate them? It may be taking on some sort of responsibility for something that was important to them. It could be many things. It's a way of saying thank you and that you continue to live inside of me. And if you're not ready to commemorate them, don't worry. This day will come again, and you will have had another year to authentically express where you are in the conversation. Things will change because you will change, and your relationship will change with it. The only things that don't change are the things we refuse to express. So the windows of Yizkor give us the opportunity to put our toes into the water of one form of expression, one way of viewing the relationship and where we are in it to another. So having danced through the year of Yizkor, ask yourself 2 questions. Where am I in the conversation? How has the conversation changed? The fact that the conversation can change is further proof of another of Reb Zalman's teachings. Death, he said, as he winked, doesn't have to be lethal. How are you feeling? Some years one or the other of these windows on Yizkor is harder or easier to go through, and that's part of its beauty, showing how the relationship continues to grow and to change, and how we have grown in our depth to tolerate both the pain and experience more compassion as the conversation continues. So take a breath. I'm going to just whip through the 4 seasons again, and then maybe you have some questions for me, and then we will explore it again as time permits, and then look at some of the prayers. So Yom Kippur is an opportunity to look at unfinished business and express those issues back and forth in conversation with the person who died. Shemini Atzeret, which opens up the winter as we pray for rain, is an opportunity to just feel the sadness, recognize what we can learn from, and recognize what we can't change. Pesach, Passover, is an opportunity in the midst of spring to explore how are we still in bondage to the past. And Shavuot is a time to measure what is it that we've learned, what were the gifts, and how do we want to express our gratitude. So where are you today? Where were you last year? Where do you think you might be next year as the conversation continues? I'd like to hear from you or any other questions that you may have. Yes.
It's not that I have a question, but I'm not from the Hebrew faith.
Uh-huh.
And I absolutely love everything I ever hear about the ritual and the ways, the deep ways of thinking about our human and spiritual experience. And so I thank you already for this.
Well, thank you. Thank you. You know, my belief, and I may have talked about this last year, that quote that I gave you from David, from the Psalm, was part of the Psalm that he wrote for the dedication of the temple, so they say. And my sense is that he envisioned a place of healing, a place where we create a dance, a circular dance, that will bring people closer and closer to their wholeness. And I think that that is the background of all of Western religion. And that if we could go back peacefully to that Temple Mount and together build something that's about healing, we would really have the essence of what it's all about. And maybe we would have a chance of saving our world. Thank you. Questions, thoughts, reflections?
Related to angels, if I may.
Uh-huh.
So I was hearing a doctor today and a nurse the other day who work with dying people talk about dying people who are going back and forth a bit, speak about angels and speak about their ancestors who have already passed on, greeting them. Now these are secular people, they are not religious people, a nurse, a doctor, and it matches up with what I've heard from rabbis. So can you say more about being greeted by the angels and the ancestors or what is passing?
Well, I mean, first of all, you have to remember that we know nothing. And Jonathan Omerman, some of you may know him, Rabbi Jonathan Omerman, who was another of my main teacher, used to say that religion is for people who are afraid of going to hell, and spirituality is for people who have been there and come back. And so I think that when we go back to these religious practices with this understanding of the great that we live in mystery, I know I have a dog, and believe me, I could spend the whole hour or more talking about my dog, but my dog has sense gates into the universe that I don't have. I have these lousy 5, 6, maybe 7 senses, and through that I perceive the universe. But there may be a million ways of perceiving the universe. We as human beings are limited to this understanding, so how could we possibly understand what life and death are really about? Or what as I said, the artist formerly known as God is really about? The word for God in Hebrew is actually yud he vav he, which is a verb. It's a verb, it's not a noun. I love to tell people that one of our problems is that we learn to be Jewish in English, and so we miss a lot of what the real translation means. So yud he vav he means being, isness, unfolding of mystery. So people, I've been at the bedside of people who are dying, and I've seen them seem to go someplace else and then kind of be reeled back by a kiss and cling to that kiss and not want to leave that person that they love and not want to leave them in pain and bereavement, and then go out and spin into this other world where there's no pain. So I'm not going to try to tell you exactly how angels work, but I will say that we have these metaphors. I feel that so much of religion, so much of the Bible gives us metaphors for trying to understand what we can never understand, and to learn to be able to feel okay with the great mystery. That's really what being a spiritual person is all about. I remember years ago, this young woman came to me. Her sister had died, and she wanted to know exactly where her sister was. And I said, I can't tell you where your sister is, but I can give you tools for being okay with the not knowing. She chose to go to the Kabbalah Center, where they were more than happy to tell her exactly, where it was. And then years later, I heard from her again because her healing was not complete. I could walk you through the Kabbalistic understanding of life after death and talk about angels. But again, it's metaphor. We don't know what really happens, but we have to be open to the mystery of not knowing and allow ourselves to be curious, because curiosity is also at the base of spirituality. Curiosity, you don't see curiosity in people who are certain of where things are and what things do and what happens exactly and what God is. But curiosity allows us to live with these unbearable truths about what it means to be human, and then to feel compassion for our unknowing and for that pain. So I don't think I answered your question, but I think I did. I wish I could tell you, but the metaphor of the angels playing lacrosse with the soul, for me, is absolutely brilliant. Yes.
So you started off your presentation beautifully with Seed in New Orleans with Nigunim.
Mm-hmm.
It's my understanding that the Jewish tradition that's so rich in song is not typically rich in song during grief and dying and
Oh, I think that's such a brilliant observation, and I think it totally matches what I said initially. I mean, we serve lentils because there's no mouth, there's no words, and so why try to? I mean, there's even though I walk under the in the valley of the shadow of death, I'm not sure that's really a comforting song to sing to people who are grieving. I think it's an open wound and to provide a balm at the very beginning. But what you can do is give people the opportunity to, to find their deepest feelings and turn them into noise that has some sort of a musical quality. Does that answer you? I mean, I think
Philosophically, yes, but I was also curious, is there Rabbi commentary about that? Are there any composers who have taken that on?
well, there's certainly composers who have written beautiful symphonies about Kaddish or about some of the prayers. There are. And one of my friends recently, it's a few years ago, lost her son. You may have known him, Nico Linish. Did you know Nico? Some of you may have. He was just a magnificent young man, and the whole community. I live in Los Angeles, and I'm a member of Temple Israel of Hollywood, and the whole community just gathered together. And actually, there was a Nigun workshop in Berkeley dedicated to him. And at some point, not very long after Nico died, my friend said, Psalms have been helping people for a long time. I don't know that anything can help me right now, but why don't we study Psalms together? And this is a group I'd been studying Torah with for maybe 10 years, once a week, sometimes twice a week. So we started with Psalm 1, and we did something called Lectio Divina, which takes a line from a psalm, and then you turn it into your own words. So it might be written by David for his son Solomon, but I would write, this is a letter to my daughter. I mean, so you just go through one line at a time, and then we would all create these really beautiful poems, and after a while you could see some sort of theology emerging, and more important for my friend Deborah, Nico's mother, you could see that she was finding her voice. You could see that she was able to express things that she had never been able to express before, and certainly about the not knowing, and about the possibility of comfort, also about rage and all the other things, because all of those are in the Psalms. So I think they're there in the liturgy. They're there in the words of Psalms. They're there in magnificent choral pieces. But I think that what you reflected on is really very, very insightful, because it's just not a time when you can put it into words. The phrase "come to terms," I never really knew what that meant, but it's literally, how can I find the words in this wilderness for what has happened, because my whole universe has been altered and changed, and I just don't have words yet. Thank you for making that connection. Other things? Come on. Where are you in the conversations? And has the conversation changed?
I don't know if this question's okay. There's going to be a lecture next on choosing suicide.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know if it's okay to ask you is, what are the Jewish points of view on final exit?
Well, it's an interesting question. Technically, suicide is not a right. The belief is that your soul belongs to God, and it's up to God when that soul leaves the body. However, from earliest times, the rabbis have looked with compassion on troubled souls and have pretty much come to the conclusion that no one in their right mind would do that. So it's more often seen, although, the truth is sometimes people were in their right mind when they did it. But it basically, technically, someone who commits suicide is supposed to be buried outside the cemetery, and and you're not supposed to mourn them. But since since we look more compassionately at their struggle, all of that is kind of erased. So, I also think, when they wrote these rules and laws, they didn't envision tubes and, I imagine that some of the diseases that we have today, which are environmentally caused, weren't a problem for them. I just think that we live in such a different world. And, in Judaism, Judaism is a conversation with the Torah that has continued for thousands of years. And it weaves in, what's really happening in the world around, at least for most people, not for some. And so, I think that question of whether or not a person has a right to choose the time of exit, we have to look at it differently in today's words. But that's what tradition teaches, and it also comes up with a remedy so that we can look compassionately at those who commit suicide. Does that answer your question?
Well, I was also talking about people who were terminally ill.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, they didn't envision people living, it was just such a different world. So, I have certain issues. Obviously, my mother committed suicide, but, I just want to always make sure that anybody who makes that choice is not making it because their Medicare has refused to pay, and is not making it for reasons that don't have to do with the extreme distress of the body and the soul. And I really fear that in today's world, where there's so often so little compassion, that choice is made prematurely. I also know that there's a lot of growth that happens on the deathbed. There's a lot of things that often get said. There are a lot of ways that people resolve long-standing issues in family and in their own lives. And I worry that prematurely ending a life robs people of that conversation. And so, it's such a delicate thing. And yes, I understand why my mother killed herself, and I forgive her. That doesn't mean it didn't screw up my life enormously, and that I had a lot of work to do, and that I had to be angry. So, everything is a paradox. Nothing is set in stone, except maybe a tombstone. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I just got here, and my question is, are any of these materials available?
They'll all be up on the thing. We haven't actually talked about these. They're in my book, Mourning and Mitzvah, and I think they'll be up on the website. Well, do you have the red one?
No, I don't have I have
A
a smaller one.
smaller one?
Smaller size.
Well, the red one has all of this, and it has a lot more.
Okay.
So, yeah, not to do a commercial, but I guess that's what people do when they speak. Let's see, we're supposed to end soon. So I'll just quickly go through the prayers, and I don't know if they've given me this. I don't think we have them as part of the, let me see. No, I think they only gave me this handout. I had sent another one with the prayers, but I'm just gonna whip through them quickly. So on Yom Kippur, one of the prayers that we say over and over again, we chant this chant, and if you know it, sing with me. Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum Vechanun, Erech apayim v'rav chesed ve'emet, notze chesed lalafim, nose avan va'fesha ve'hataha ve'nakeh. And that chant that we say so many times during the high holidays is what God said to Moses in the Torah. These are the 13 attributes of God's compassion. Merciful, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness and truth, bestowing mercy for thousands of generations, forgiving iniquity, transgression and sin, and wiping the slate clean. So God said to Moses, remind me when I get angry that this is who I really am. And so this is the work of Yom Kippur, to look at the places where we may have anger that lingers, our guilt that lingers, and over and over sing these words of compassion to God, to ourselves, to the people who have died, as a way of moving ourselves from that anger at the unfinished business to a sense of love and compassion. The next prayer that's said is the El Malei Rachamim, which I think I spoke of earlier. El Malei Rachamim means God filled with compassion, and compassion, as I said, has the same root as the Hebrew word for womb. So my sense is this prayer, which asks that the soul of the deceased be held under the wings of God, under the wings of the Shekhinah, in the womb of God, tells us, probably the only place, one of the only places that we have in much of Jewish liturgy, about what we believe about the afterlife, or what we believe about life, which is that we go from womb to womb. It's a journey from womb to womb. And in the middle, we try our best to align with that chant I chanted for you before, which is compassion. So we go from one womb of compassion to another womb of compassion. And in the middle, we do our best to keep scraping off the dust so that we can live in a world where we see through a lens of compassion. Then there is the Yizkor prayer, which basically says, may please remember the person who was my father or my teacher or my mother, and may they be remembered in the mysterious world of souls, and I'm going to do something good on their behalf. I'm going to perform an act of tzedakah, our justice, our generosity in their name, so that when they can reside more comfortably in the celestial Garden of Eden. And then finally, we say the Kaddish. And I'm going to end with that, and there is somebody who's supposed to come and take my, here he goes, so we can play some music. So I'm going to say a little bit about the Kaddish. The Kaddish is the prayer that we say, traditionally we say it 3 times a day during the time that we're mourning. And it doesn't mention grief. It doesn't mention mourning. It basically says that we want God's name to be magnified throughout the world. I like to think of the Kaddish as the wireless connection between the worlds, where we can express the things that need to be expressed and continue the conversation, so that every time we say Kaddish, or every time I say Kaddish for someone, I feel like it's a time for us to be together. I'm going to read you something about the Kaddish, and then I'm going to ask you if you can stand to stand, and if not, do it in your. I'm going to play Debbie Friedman's version of the Kaddish, which I think really, really gets what the Kaddish is about. So I'll read you this first. When we mourn, we strain our ears, listening for the voice of the deceased, until we hear that voice coming from our own hearts. Mourners, we yearn to continue the conversation. We search for the unsaid words to resolve the unfinished issues. The Kaddish can take us there. Kaddish parts the curtains and forces open the space between the worlds, breaking open the crevices where the voices still come through and where all the worlds are one. For the price of our yearning, our anger, our tears, the Kaddish will carry us beyond the edges of the world we know. It can take us to a place of wholeness where all the binaries, all the polarities dissolve, where black and white, male and female, God and not God merge. They become one, which is the teaching of the Shema, Judaism's most central tenet, that all is one, that God is one. And the words of the Shema, these words become the reality of the world. Kaddish ends exile. It suffuses the most profane regions with the holiness of God's name and rests in Amen from a place that it has not yet been forthcoming, a place we may have been listening for an Amen for our entire lives. And that Amen sustains the world. So if you are able, please stand. I encourage you to focus on the emotions that are salient as you reflect on the conversation with the deceased. And when you hear this unusual version of the Kaddish, which I think really gets what the Kaddish is trying to tell us, I want you to feel it in your body and turn your mourning into dancing. And maybe close your eyes so you won't.
Shalom bimra
Ve'emeru, Amen. May the one who makes peace in the highest places bring peace to their departed souls and to our own as we wrestle with our human mortality, with our human finitude, and in the short time we have here, become channels for that peace into this parched, burning, and thirsty world. Amen. Thank you.